protest around a signing day, I went along and I just felt really, really inspired by it. And yeah, similarly, the Break Free events that 350 were involved in, again, kind of really great examples of people power, where people from really different backgrounds were coming around and participating in non-violent direct action together. I was really impressed with that. And I think what some of these examples are showing is how some sort of more established organisations and more organisations with more formal structures are starting to work much better alongside the grassroots and alongside Indigenous people's movements, and I think that's really exciting. I, as a consultant, I still do quite a bit of work for Greenpeace, which is an organisation I used to work for, and they in particular have really started shifting their theory of change so that they're incorporating people power a lot more and recognising that, you know, to create sort of lasting change with integrity, that there's, you know, you're going to have to work with movements of people for that to happen. And so they've started working in a lot more kind of open way, and I think that's really exciting. I'd urge you, if you are interested in kind of people-powered campaigning, if you're interested in open campaigning, to have a look at a website set up by Greenpeace Mobilisation Lab, which has a lot of great resources on there for around mobilisation, around open campaigning, around digital campaigning, and you know, a lot of really great stories from the campaigning world to tap into. The second thing I wanted to talk about, my feeling about this year, is that it's been a year where there's been hugely unexpected things have happened, and I found myself kind of continually blown away by what's actually going on in the world. So, you know, if you think about kind of the rise of Donald Trump, or I don't know, like the really shocking terrorist attacks that happened in France. And for me, as a Brit, you know, Brexit has occupied a huge part of my headspace in the last couple of months, which, you know, kind of came out of nowhere, and the sort of political events that followed it. And I think what that highlights for me as a campaigner is just that, you know, some of the usual kind of analytical frames that we use and assumptions that we make just don't work for us anymore. You know, if you think about Brexit, then there was a lot that we assumed about how people would vote, for example, along class lines, that they would align themselves with the Labour Party, or that people would vote according to what they thought was going to be kind of economically savvy, or that what else? Or that people would vote for the status quo. But none of those things happened, and I think that, yeah, really highlights that we need to change the way we think. And I've noticed a few more of the bigger organisations this year are sort of trying to think about kind of different ways of analysing the world. One thing that's being talked about quite a lot is systems thinking. So that is not necessarily, Oxfam actually released a really cool video and great guide earlier this year that talked about systems thinking, and it sort of used the example of, you know, that old saying of like, if you teach someone how to fish, they'll feed themselves for a lifetime. And, you know, as Oxfam, they might have thought that that would be their kind of one way of approaching the objective of someone being able to sustain themselves. But actually there are a lot more things that influence that person's ability to fish and gain a living from fishing. You know, the water might be polluted, they might not have access to markets, the fisherman might actually be a woman, and so patriarchy might prevent them from fishing or from selling their wares, etc., etc. And what Oxfam are trying to emphasise is actually there's, you know, many multiple factors that will influence an outcome, and within each of those multiple factors there may be a whole other system that's operating. Equally, systems thinking helps us think a bit more about those kind of unexpected events. You know, if we think about the world, there are huge, you know, we've got to start thinking a bit more about kind of the disruptions that are happening, things like the economic crash in 2008, or how disruptive technologies are completely changing marketplaces or the way things are done, or, you know, political disruptions like Brexit. And yeah, systems thinking can help us a bit with that. I think most importantly we need to think that kind of, you know, change isn't necessarily linear, things can happen very suddenly. And also that narrowing down our focus on kind of really key targets sometimes isn't always helpful. We need to think more broadly. So, you know, what does that mean for us as campaigners? Well, I think it means a number of things. It means, you know, when we did boot camp last September, I talked a lot about making sure you did kind of analysis in advance of your campaign planning, and it really emphasises the need for that analysis, using some of the same tools, using problem trees, using power analyses, but also maybe thinking more about kind of mapping the systems and how they relate to each other. You know, I think that can be overwhelming, and so it's still important to use some of those tools that help you focus, like critical pathways, but it's important to recognise what's going on externally. Also, we need to kind of continually challenge our assumptions and make sure we're testing our plans and what we're thinking. Oxfam suggests, for example, when you're doing your planning process, bringing in kind of unusual and different stakeholders to help you test your theories, test what you're thinking. You know, it suggests, for example, bringing people in from the corporate world, or bringing in people from government, or bringing people who, you know, bringing in members of your kind of target audiences. The other thing that I think, how we, you know, these kind of new ways of thinking, what they emphasise is that because change isn't linear, and because the world is changing so quickly, that we need to take a far more iterative approach to our campaigning. You know, it's not just a question of setting out a critical pathway for 5 years and then just following it. We need to take lots of points to stop and review and to change and adapt and to test. All of those things need to kind of happen continually as part of our campaign process. And that sort of neatly segues me into the final thing I wanted to talk about, which is monitoring and evaluation. And I talk about that mainly because that's something I've been doing a lot of this year and thinking about a lot. And I think, you know, monitoring and evaluation, certainly in the campaign circles I've operated in, is generally thought of as a bit of a, almost a dirty word. It's very boring, bureaucratic. It's a tick box exercise. It's not real work. And, you know, I want to emphasise that I think monitoring and evaluation, or if you want to talk about it as kind of impact assessment or part of your sort of learning model, is vitally important. It's really crucial that when you're planning your campaigns, that you put in place or think about when your review points are going to be. When are you going to stop and look back and say, what went well, what did we do well, what didn't go so well, what would we do differently next time? How can we adapt our campaign and shape what we're doing so that we're more effective? And that's really, really vital. Secondly, I think, you know, we are starting to campaign far more openly, and we have a huge amount of resources now to help us do that. Again, I think big organisations are trying to think more about, you know, if we're doing evaluations, which often, you know, just get written into a big report and filed somewhere, how do we actually best use that learning? How can it be, you know, how can it be most useful to us? I just did an evaluation for Greenpeace New Zealand on, they did a massive disobedience at an oil conference here. And it was a new way of working for them, and they really wanted to make sure that they learned from it. And so we made sure that we created assets out of it, documents that could be both shared across the organisation, so that the learnings weren't so specific to Greenpeace New Zealand, but could be used by other parts of the org. And also turned it into a blog piece that could be helpful for the wider movement. And I think, you know, thinking about how we can best share our learnings will really help, you know, build the movement, improve how everybody's doing campaigning. Now, you know, all that feels like complete common sense, and, you know, when you talk to people, they're like, yeah, you know, that sounds great. But actually, as campaigners, as I said, the problem is we don't consider some of that our real work. It's sort of an add-on if we have time, and we never have time, right? And I think that's the cultural shift that has to happen, is that we need to start thinking about those kind of reflections, reviewing, taking the time to share, taking the time to learn from others as being far more of our sort of core work of how we do things, because that's, you know, helps us improve, it stops us from making the same mistakes over and over again, and means that we, you know, hopefully start working together to kind of do things differently, do things better, do things smarter. So yeah, those are sort of some of the things I've been thinking about and working on over the last year.